Whether you're doing fabrication, you're doing woodworking, you're doing carpentry, you'll never replace these items right here. That's right, the Speed Square, well, Swanson owns the Speed Square name, rafter square, whatever you want to call it, or the combination square, you'll never replace those items. However, there are limitations to each. That's where these come in. These are the new Speed Squares. I don't even know if they're calling them Speed Squares. From Fireball Tool, specifically for fabrication and metalwork. However, I can see this being used across those other platforms as well, like carpentry and woodworking. For just 32 bucks, you can get 3 of the Fireball Tool stainless steel squares, and they come in 5-inch, 8-inch, and 10-inch models. Let's dive in, take a closer look, and see what we think about them. So real quick, just a kind of a history, tool history 101 for you. Whenever somebody sees one of these, or they ask you to get you one of these, or hand you one of these, or point one of these out, 9 times out of 10, they're going to call it a Speed Square. However, Speed Square is like a Kleenex, okay? A tissue is a Kleenex. Everybody knows that. Well, Kleenex is a brand. Same thing with a Speed Square. Swanson came out with the Speed Square, so that's why on any of the Swanson squares, you'll see it called a Speed Square. Everybody else, like Crescent and any of the other tool makers that come out with one of their Speed Squares, are not allowed to call it a Speed Square. So that's why you won't see it anywhere on here. They may call it a rafter square or a square, whatever. We get it. Anything like this is typically called a Speed Square. So just so you know, Swanson owns that name. Speed Squares are amazing. They work great in so many different trades. They're very handy to have. However, there are some limitations to them, especially when it comes to metalworking or fabrication. And especially when you get into the larger sizes of steel, there are some limitations that really stick out on these squares. Now, Fireball Tool has come out with some new squares. And by the way, if you're not aware of Fireball Tool, check out their website. They really do some amazing stuff, anywhere from, showing welding skills, how to keep things square, how to use different tools, and even they make some amazing tools as well, especially when it gets into the heavy fabrication stuff. Anyway, they came out with these 3 tools, and this is a 5-inch square, an 8-inch square, and a 10-inch square. A lot of cool things about this. Not your typical Speed Square with a foot on the bottom. In fact, instead of the flat part being on one of the right angle or one of the smaller legs, it's actually on the hypotenuse of the actual square and on the bottom there. And then we have these different grooves at 90 degrees and at 22.5 degrees as well as 45 degrees. Now let's talk about why that is and how these are going to differ from others. Now, if we take a piece of simple 1-inch square tubing, pretty typical light fabrication stuff. You're building shelving, you're building, small accessories on race cars, things like that. Very handy, steel to have around. The Speed Square works quite well. You can draw square on it. You can even draw your 45s on it. Not a lot of limitations when it comes to this. However, there is a little bit when you actually have to kind of come around the side of the steel, and then, we have to line that up again, make our marks, kind of work our way around. So there are some limitations even on the smaller stuff, but it tends to work pretty well with that. However, when you get into the larger stuff, there are a few limitations here because, again, in our marking, so here on the large flat side, not a problem. We can make our marks. We can make our mark here, but it just doesn't extend down very, very far to then make our mark. So then we got to carry on back around here. Put our square over here, line up our mark again, go here, and then again work our way around. Still not a huge limitation there. However, with the new Fireball squares, now this one's a little bit small for that size, so I could go to my 5-inch. And again, now I've got my 90 here. But not only that, if I flip this around, look at right here. So I've also got my 90 right here as well, or my 90 on the end. Not only that, I get measurements right here starting from the actual base of the steel. So I know from here, here's my 1-inch mark, here's my 2-inch mark, so I can make some marks there if I want to. Here's my 3-inch mark, so I can mark that all the way up. I can mark that around here. I can mark it down here and make my different marks. Or if I need a 22.5-degree angle, there it is. There's my 45. So right there from one position, I can make all those marks. Outgoing angles here, my measurements start from the center. And that's so if we need to start from basically, and I'll show you this from another side, then we can start from here in. And by the way, look, we got a little kickstand there as well. So that's going to stand up on its own, and it's going to stand up on its own here. Now, on a typical speed square, we can stand it up here, but when it gets to there, yeah, we really don't have a lot of base there. But on this one, it's going to have a lot stronger stance when we put it on any of the edges. So now let me flip this around like this. And so now let's see if we had to measure from, say, this side here, or we wanted to check to see if this was square. Well, if I take my typical speed square, you see when I go to butt it up against there, we've got a weld here that is in the way. So that weld is not going to let us put that square all the way against this edge to check for square. Yeah, we can eyeball it and see if it's out any, but we really like to see that butt all the way up against there. So we can do a couple of things. We could modify our square and actually kind of cut this angle off and grind it off. And yeah, you could definitely do that. I've got a couple of speed squares around here that I've done that on. So you could definitely do that. But out of the box, we can't check that square when there's a weld down in there. Well, the cool thing about the Fireball squares is that you see this tip is actually cut off right here. So I can actually go in, but all the way against that, without a worry to check to see if we're square. Looks like we're a little out there at the top, but you can see how quickly we can get in there and check that. Even on that large weld there, we're still missing that. Now, the smaller we get on the squares, the smaller the cutout is on that. So with their smaller 8-inch, I'm not going to be able to do that. But when I step up to the 10-inch, now my cutout's big enough that I can check that. So as your steel gets larger, that's where you definitely go to your larger squares as well, which absolutely makes sense. Could you see another way we could use these, or is there a different tool you'd like to see? Now let's bring in some even larger steel. I believe this should be 4-inch by 4-inch. So we can check, actually 5-inch by 5-inch square tubing with like a 3/8 wall on this. So we've got this 5/8 tubing, and if you'll look at the radius here on the edges, it rolls quite a bit, which means that if we put our typical speed square up there, that looks great. We can draw a nice straight line if we want to and make our mark. However, what if we needed to measure from there? Well, if you take a closer look here, if I turn this around, you'll see this edge is actually on part of this roll. And again, the larger the size you get, the more of a radius you have and the less likely you are to actually be measuring from the flat here. So your measurements may not be dead on. Now, it may not matter that much. We're welding. We can always add to, but still, the larger you go, the less likely you are to be in that perfection range, or at least be in that excellence range of marking things. Whereas, even with the smallest one, you see how big of a base we have here. We're definitely going from this flat here, even though we have that large radius, it's not a problem with the Fireball tool square. And of course, with the largest one, we're going to get our best, and then we can even, and this is great here. So I can mark my 45 right here, and then I can come down here, and I can mark my straight there, even all the way around this, without having to lift the tool up and lay it down again. And I could go here. I could carry my mark on out, carry it there. And again, you see I'm getting two sides without having to move that square and without having to line it up again. So we've got a lot better shot at getting a lot tighter cut, or getting our pieces almost exactly where we want them. Or I could turn this around, come to here, line up my mark over here, and now draw my 45 this way. Or if I wanted to go 45, line my mark up here, again, go 45 out there, and I can even draw all the way around this radius, like you'll see right here. You can start here and go all the way around that radius and even down the back. Same thing with my 90 or a 22.5 or my 45 as well. Again, trying to do that with this. I can mark on my flat, and I may be able to mark, no, I really can't mark my edge on the flat there because, again, we're not really on the edge, so I can just kind of roll the edge if I want to, but I really don't get a mark all the way down, and then I'm guessing when I come back around this way and trying to line that back up and make my mark. So we can get it close, and again, I know we're welding and fabricating, so we can always add to the metal, but we get a lot better finish when we're actually getting those marks as close to dead on as possible when we're laying this stuff out. Which brings to another point. Even the layout stuff, this can come in very handy as well. So now we may have this tacked to the table, we may have it clamped down to the table, but now we can use our tools for marking that as well. So now I can bring my tool over, I can make my mark here, I can make my mark here. So now I'm not only marking my table, but also marking my material and carrying things out and laying things out on our table, which that happens quite often when you're trying to figure out a complete plan on doing a layout or doing good fabrication work. And then finally, just marking with this, much like you may do with a speed square, in the fact if I needed to make a longitudinal or a mark all the way down this, I could put this at the 2-inch level, draw that down, and now I'm 2 inches out on every single one. Or if I need to go to the 3-inch, there we go. Do it with my chalk at 3 1/4. Just makes it really, really easy with those measurements already laser etched on there. So check them out. They're a really great addition to your existing tools you may have already. Again, very handy that they come in these different sizes from 5-inch, 8-inch, and then even the 10-inch models. And the fact that you get all three of these for $32, I don't think you can really beat that. Got their logo right there on the backside. So lots of measurements all over this thing. I could see this being a more and more useful tool around the shop, especially when it comes to fabrication. So check them out. Hey, don't forget us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and even TikTok. Have a great day and keep smiling.